parliamentlive.tv 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 parliamentlive.tv. 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 parliamentlive.tv, 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 parliamentlive.tv,
An area where I'm constrained.
Yeah.
You know, if
But on something that you said so far, you said that updates are provided. provided to the Prime Minister,
Yes.
to anybody else?
Via me.
My colleague David Jones, please. David.
You'll appreciate that the questions we're asking you now are the blog post that was published on Friday last week by Dominic Cummings, which I'm sure you've read. Is that right?
Yes, sorry, yes, of course, yeah.
And in that blog post, Mr. Cummings refers to conversations that he had with you, apparently in circumstances where no one else was present. Do you accept the truth of what Mr. Cummings says in that regard?
Again, I'm afraid I'm genuinely not trying to frustrate the committee, but I am constrained in what I can say because it's in the context of an ongoing investigation. So I'm apologetic, as I said, recognising legitimate parliamentary concern in this. We've gone down the exceptional route of providing briefings to the Speaker of the House on Privy Council terms, so that, you know, as far as we can, Parliament is being updated on the detail of the investigation.
So, are you able to help the committee? Did you authorise the Prime Minister's then official spokesman to tell the media that your inquiry had shown that neither Mr. Cummings nor the then Director of Communications were the lockdown leakers?
Again, you know, I really am sympathetic to, you know, the committee, and I am not trying to frustrate, but this is drawing me into details of an ongoing investigation, which, for the reasons I've set out, I can't go into in this setting, which is why we've taken the exceptional step of updating the Speaker of the House on Privy Council terms to make sure that at least the parliamentary authority is aware of the content and detail of the investigation.
You made the point earlier that you didn't want to be unfair on anyone who was being investigated, but of course, if you were to simply confirm what I just put to you, you could immediately exclude both Mr. Cummings and the Director of Communications from the inquiry, couldn't you?
But again, you're inviting me to comment on the detail of an ongoing investigation, which, as I've said, I'm under constraints relating to classification, etc. And so I'm afraid I can't go into these sorts of details. But as I say, we've been updating the Speaker on the progress with this inquiry, and as soon as it's concluded, the Prime Minister's committed to setting out the conclusions for Parliament, so that you will be able to see where we've got to.
And did you give instructions to the official spokesman to confirm that neither Mr. Cummings nor the Director of Communications were the leakers?
Again, I'm afraid, Mr. Jones, my answer is the same as before. I can't go into these sorts of details relating to an ongoing inquiry. I really, you know, as I say, I apologise to the committee. It is not out of rudeness or disrespect to the committee, but there are constraints on what I can say in this forum, which is why we've taken the exceptional steps of keeping the Speaker updated on progress, and as the Prime Minister said, we will update Parliament on the conclusions as soon as they're available.
Thank you.
I wonder, therefore, if I could ask when the Speaker was last updated.
It was a fortnight ago.
A fortnight ago?
Yeah, I will come back to you if I've got that date.
Thank you. My colleague Lloyd Russell Moyle, please.
Do you think the leaker has broken any laws? Are we discussing law breaking here, or are we discussing embarrassment?
This was looked at as part of the gateway process, and it concluded that process involving the police and the Crown Prosecution Service, etc., concluded that this leak did not meet the thresholds for an offence under the Official Secrets Act or the offence of misconduct in public office.
Thank you. So if it doesn't meet an offence criteria, doesn't threaten national security and the Official Secrets Act, can I ask why, therefore, you're unable to furnish us with some more of the detail of the questions that we have just asked you, particularly around questions where we have asked whether you have said things to press officers for them to pass on publicly, and you're not able to either confirm or deny that?
No, I mean...
These are not legal matters anymore.
So obviously, just because something isn't a criminal offence doesn't mean there aren't national security issues involved in the or classified matters, rather, I should say, very specifically, in relation to how that investigation is conducted, and that's why I'm unable to comment.
So are the national security services involved in this investigation?
As you know, we have a long-standing policy of neither confirming or denying such things. And I'm sorry, as I say, I recognise legitimate public
has informed you that you cannot answer these questions.
Yeah, so this is in collaboration with the government security group who own the processes.
So the government security group have deemed that you're not allowed to answer any questions on any detail of this, or has there been certain parameters set?
No, I mean, beyond the things that I've said, I'm afraid I constrain, which is the ongoing investigation. I'm afraid I'm limited to not much more than that. You know, what I can say, I have already said to the committee.
Okay. Look, I'll ask one more question. Conversations that you've had that are not about the investigation, but are conversations that you may have had to people like the press spokesperson. Why is that? Why are you unable to answer our questions on that? I'm not asking about the process of the investigation. I'm not asking how the investigation happens. But David Jones asked specific questions about conversations you'd had with a public press officer.
Because those conversations are covered by the bounds of the investigation.
Okay. Not entirely convinced, but thank you very much.
As I said, I can only apologise to the committee again for these constraints I'm operating, and which is why we have, which is why, with the Prime Minister's permission, we've been updating the Speaker on Privy Council terms.
I mean, I wonder if, and I don't want to put too much power in our chairman, but I do wonder if there is a case to be updating our chairman on in-camera kind of basis. Because I think that this is not a parliamentary procedure issue per se, it is a internal scrutiny issue of the Cabinet Office. For no disrespect to the Speaker is not in charge of scrutiny of the functioning of the civil service. This committee is, and our chairman is.
Look, I mean, I'm very happy to pick that up with the chairman and the relevant authorities. It sounds like a potential way through. And again, I understand, apologise for having to frustrate what are legitimate lines of inquiry.
Thank you very much. Can I go to John McDonnell, please?
Mr. Case, you can understand our frustration because it's 5 months on, isn't it, since the beginning of this inquiry, so it hardly demonstrates some prioritisation of what is, or should be to you and others, a serious matter. And at the same time as the inquiry drags on, Number 10 spokespeople are able to issue statements tarnishing the name of others who are obviously subject to the inquiry themselves. I find it incredulous it's taken so long. However, you mentioned that the instigation of these inquiries is at the hands of the Prime Minister or a permanent secretary. Could I ask you, is there to be an inquiry into today's leakage of the alleged statement by the Prime Minister about thousands of bodies being piled high in the streets, or his preference to that rather than a lockdown?
This isn't something I've looked at today. An investigation hasn't started, but that's something I'll have to take away, look into, discuss with the Prime Minister about whether it's something we need to conduct an investigation into.
But will you have the authority to instigate that yourself?
Yes, but I think it would be very unusual to instigate a leak inquiry without first consulting the Prime Minister.
But you have the independence to do that after that consultation?
Yes, if necessary, but in my experience, not ever needed.
But that's for you to consider. That's a responsibility that you will have after your conversations with the Prime Minister, and you will consider it.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Jackie Doyle-Price, I believe.
Thank you, Chairman. I'd like to try and help you out a bit here, Mr. Case, because I think people watching these proceedings won't have very much confidence in leak inquiries on the basis of what we're hearing. But as you mentioned earlier, some of these leak inquiries are inevitably going to be complex. And to be frank, if I was wanting to leak information and I was one of a limited number of people who had access to it, there are ways you could go to actually cover that up, and that is actually going through your networks of context. Now, I don't know if you've seen, but Robert Peston has this lunchtime published the details of the text that he received outlining this decision. And it's very, very clear that it's become third party. So when it comes to a leak of that kind, obviously you can look at the phones of the protagonists that were in the meeting, but what else do you do once you've drawn a blank at those? Because of course, the fact it's not on their phones doesn't mean they're not guilty of the leak. And I think, what we're concerned about here in this committee is that at this length of time, why has there not been more progress? Is it not a priority?
Again, I understand the point of the questioning. I can assure the committee, at no point has this investigation been in any way deprioritised. It's in the hands of professional investigators who have a range of tools and techniques at their disposal. You'll understand if I don't go into those in detail in open session, because that would prejudice future inquiries. But I can assure you that this hasn't been deprioritised in any way. But as you picked up, these things are incredibly complicated, complex inquiries, usually with a range of threads to them. Lines of inquiries develop. Some of those get resolved. Some of them take a long time and patient work to resolve. I mean, a lot of this really is painstaking and patient work, and it's done by professional investigators.
But the more, I guess, if we think back to recently, for example, when Gavin Williamson was dismissed because he was highlighted as being a source leak, that was actually a very obvious, that was a very quick investigation. But if somebody is being willfully malevolent and deliberately covering their tracks, clearly that's very more difficult to source. But the fact that we're still this many months on it, this is not actually a very good disincentive to bad behaviour, isn't it? Well, I mean, if people can see that leaks are happening with no negative outcome for people doing it, the fact it's happened, I still see how we can maintain confidence in our existing government structures. Right? Do you feel that, I mean, obviously, setting aside the fact that the investigation is done by professionals, Do we really need to do more to make sure that people understand their obligations here? And that's not just ministers, but of course everybody who works with them, which seems to be an ever-growing number of people outside the normal civil service corps.
So I'd sort of pick up a couple of points that you've made. I think that sense of frustration that you describe, that we are unable to catch more people responsible for leaks, is shared by a range of senior people, not only this Prime Minister, but other Prime Ministers I've known, and I know my predecessors. Of course, under the initial stages of this, that first level, the government security group, actually all the processes are voluntary. We do have, obviously, where it relates to employees, we're able to place clear obligations on employees to cooperate with inquiries, and of course where they don't, which is very rare, that in itself would be a sign of something unusual for somebody not to cooperate. But it's obviously only once you reach outside that employment context, it's only once you reach the thresholds for the police to become involved, you've actually got the powers to compel. I mean, obviously it's a matter for Parliament to decide what powers it's willing to give to authorities in government to conduct these, and it's something that I know has been looked at several times.
Or
Sorry.
sit down to the Prime Ministers and set some very clear rules about ministerial behaviour, because the truth of the matter is that for the last decade, ministers have been going to cabinet meetings, and then we've been getting a blow-by-blow account of them in the newspapers. And once you have that established behaviour, which goes unchallenged, you are setting up a code of practice which enables people to say what they like to the press. So perhaps if I could invite you to comment, would you like to see greater discipline by Cabinet about all collective meeting notices taken? And perhaps that could go some way to starting to set a new set of rules about how we govern our political culture.
I agree with you that the culture is absolutely vital. I can assure you that cabinet ministers, officials, permanent and temporary, are very regularly reminded of their obligations, and I'm not sure they could be more clearly spelt out, including often reminding people of those at the beginnings of meetings. But I agree with the underpinning point in your question that this is a great deal to do with the culture, and valuing the integrity of government processes is vital.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. David Jones.
Yes, just briefly, Mr. Case. I think I heard you rightly. You said, didn't you, that the last discussion with the Speaker on Privy Council terms was about a fortnight ago. Was that right?
Yeah, that's my understanding. But I said if that wasn't correct, I'd come back.
I mean, there have been a huge number of developments over the past 2 weeks, not least the publication by Dominic Cummings last Friday of his blog. Given that the communication with the Speaker appears to be the only extent to which Parliament is being kept informed of developments, don't you feel that there should be more regular discussions with the Speaker, and that certainly there should be discussions now that Mr. Cummings has published this article?
Very happy to take that up with the Speaker, and provide a bang up-to-date update.
And just briefly, can you remember a time when Downing Street has been more leaky?
It's sort of quite a difficult comparison. I think if you go back through the ages and you read diaries and historical memoirs, leaks of government information are a long-standing frustration in government. I think one of the points that underpins your question was Downing Street being leaky. Of course, you would, as it were, not always proven that, or even believe that Downing Street is the source of leaks. So there's one point underlying your question that I just pick up. But as I said before,
do you dispute it? Has the leak not come from Downing Street?
As I said, you're inviting me back to commenting on an ongoing investigation, which I'm afraid I can't do for the reasons set out. And I apologise. I can only apologise again for that, Mr. Chair.
Karen Smith.
Thank you. Mr. Case, you're the guardian of the propriety and ethics and civil service conduct in your role. Do you think it's acceptable that you come before this committee to discuss these matters, having been told that you can't discuss them? You're essentially pleading the fifth. Is that acceptable?
As I said, I can only apologise to.
No, that's okay. Thanks for your apology. But is it acceptable?
Well, yeah, I'm afraid it's necessary. To protect the integrity of an ongoing investigation and the techniques involved.
Okay. You said you spoke with the Speaker, or the officer spoke with the Speaker 2 weeks ago. I would need to check exactly when you were coming before this committee, but as Mr. Jones has said, given the events of the last 2 weeks, why at no stage did you think it would be reasonable or acceptable to write to the committee to set out what you were and were not prepared to talk to us about today?
I'm not quite sure I understand the particular point about the.
Well, the point is we are gathered
weeks.
and do work to scrutinise the Cabinet Office and your role, and we've spent nearly 40 minutes in a circle because you are not prepared to answer questions that you could have written to us previously and told us that was the case.
Well, I mean, again, accept my apologies for not making that clear in advance to the whole committee.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Just concluding on this, you mentioned, Mr. Case, that I think I inferred from one of your answers that you don't think the Official Secrets Act is up to scratch. Do you think we need a new one then to bring it up to date?
This is something that I think either is or will be consulted on, and obviously will come before Parliament. I'm sure this might be the next.
Okay, so that will be happening. I'm aware of a leak inquiry that began in August of 2020 and hasn't yet concluded, so an even longer leak inquiry. I don't expect you to go into the specifics of any leak inquiries that were begun in August of 2020, but will those began in August be completed anytime soon?
I'm afraid I'm not sure which particular case you're talking
broadly
about.
We're getting on for 9 months or so. Well, is that not sufficient time for a leak inquiry?
It entirely depends on the circumstances of the investigation. I mean, sometimes these things can take a very long time indeed. When the professional investigators believe that there are no strands or lines of inquiry left, they will close an investigation. But I'm very happy to. I will look at the particular case if the clerk could let me have more details.
Thank you. Now, moving on, Lord Hayward listed one of the key roles of the Cabinet Secretary as, quotes, the guardian of propriety and ethics, ministerial and civil service conduct. How do you see your role in that respect?
I think the specific role of Cabinet Secretary. There are two aspects to that in relation to propriety and ethics. One is the overall structure and framework, the codes and what have you. Often in support of the Prime Minister, to make sure the integrity of government is adequate. And then, in extremis, the Cabinet Secretary would have a role in particular cases or casework that come up in relation to propriety and ethics. But I think the point I would make, and actually more importantly, this is made in all of the codes and is spelt out and encapsulated in the Nolan Principles. Propriety and ethics is actually the responsibility of everybody in public service. And actually, to pick up one of the points made before, actually maintaining standards in public life is actually as much about culture as it is, rules and regulations. And it's, observing the spirit of those rules is the job of all senior leaders. And, interestingly, you pick up sort of Lord Hayward's quote. I have the pleasure of being able to talk quite regularly to my predecessors in this role, and actually they consistently say that one of their most difficult moments in the job were the propriety and ethics work. So this is a constant feature of cabinet secretaries' lives.
Indeed, and I think your PhD supervisor, Lord Hennessy, described the role as, quotes, the greatest keeper of secrets. So with that in mind, what levers do you have as cabinet secretary to ensure that decisions on policy are made in a proper way? I think probably three particular levers that the cabinet secretary has. The first, as mentioned, is actually around the guidance and codes. The second is actually the civil service in the round is there to support ministers in decision taking to make sure they're properly done. So actually the way civil servants support ministers, their training, skills and what have you is important to support proper decision making. And then finally, I think the third area is obviously the Cabinet Secretary is responsible for advising the Prime Minister on the collective system of government and the operation of cabinet government, which is there to make sure that decisions are made properly. Thank you. And Mr. Tierney, if I can come to you, welcome to committee in relative early days in your post. We're very grateful to have you with us this afternoon. Now, I just wonder, given reports about the reasons that contributed perhaps to your predecessor's departure from the role, how concerned are you of having to tell ministers and indeed others no?
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm not concerned by that at all. I think, though, it's worth saying that in my experience as a private secretary and senior advisor to ministers, that the reality is that most ministers come to officials seeking advice on propriety and ethics issues because they want to obviously stay within the letter and spirit of the codes. So I'm expecting in this job the vast majority of the work to be incoming requests from ministers from me and the team, and indeed when I've spoken to my predecessors, they've confirmed that's what happened with them. So I don't think you should see it as something where I'm sitting here waiting to say no to something. I see the role as more of an enabling function. I want to work with ministers and permanent secretaries to help them get the business of government done in the best way that we can.
Thank you. I'm going to move on and probably bring you back in, Mr. Tierney, at some point, but I go to David Jones, please.
Thank you, Chairman. Mr. Case, will the cost of refurbishing the Prime Minister's flat at number 10 Downing Street be paid for through private donations?
Well, if helpful, I'm sort of willing to set out the for you the thinking on this set out so far. I mean, I won't go through sort of how Downing Street works in detail, but it's relevant to this. There are obviously working offices and staterooms, and then the residences. The working rooms, staterooms, etc. The refurbishment is funded through the normal Cabinet Office estates budget. The residences, for decades, have been there's been an annual allowance of up to £30,000 a year from the public purse to support the Prime Minister of the day in contributing to the costs of refurbishing the residence. Any costs beyond that are met by Prime Ministers privately. We on the question of a trust, there's work been going on this for more than 12 months on this idea. It was actually work that was begun under Darren and my predecessors. I don't know whether you know, but Chequers and Dorneywood are actually supported by trusts, one a trust and one a charitable trust, and actually equivalent buildings around the world. Like the White House, I understand, is supported by a trust. No Downing Street Trust currently exists. Work was begun last spring, and Lord Brownlow agreed to be chair of a putative trust. There was work done to identify cross-party potential trustees. On the trust itself, when I became aware of this earlier this year, along with Alex Chisholm, the accounting officer for the Cabinet Office, although other officials have been working on it before, we've actually been looking at this question in much more detail of how a trust could work. As I say, building on the models from elsewhere. It's safe to say this is a genuinely complicated legal policy propriety issue and questions for government and for the Charity Commission, who would regulate the operation of a charitable trust. I think there are two areas that I would pick out.
Forgive me for being rude, Mr. Case, but in terms of answering Mr. Jones's question,
so I was just going to come on to the donor.
Would be most helpful if you do so.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So, I mean, the first thing I'd say is that a charitable trust can't cover private areas of Downing Street. So it's clear that can't be done. The second...
Sorry, forgive me, just interrupting there. You say that a charitable trust can't cover private areas of Downing Street. I think we understand that. But in any event, as I understand it, there's no such trust in being yet, is there?
Correct. As I was saying, this is one of the things that's being explored, yes. the trust. And so
if you recall, my question was essentially, are any private donations being used to pay the cost of refurbishing the Prime Minister's flat in Downing Street?
So I think, as the Prime Minister has said, all of this will be declared in the proper way. The Prime Minister will make relevant declarations
So
through his
you're not
ministerial...
answering that question now. Are you aware yourself whether any private donations have been used to cover the cost of refurbishing the flat at Downing Street?
So what I'm happy to tell you is that the Prime Minister's asked me to conduct a review, because I was not been involved directly in this. The Prime Minister's asked me to conduct a review.
Forgive me, Mr. Case.
I'm
I'm so sorry to interrupt you. I'm so sorry to interrupt you. I asked you whether you were aware whether or not any private donations had been used to refurbish the flat. I mean, that's a straightforward yes or no, really.
So, as I said, the Prime Minister's asked me to conduct a review into how this has been done, and asked that I share the details of those conclusions with the committee.
Well, could I ask Mr. Case, and forgive the impertinence of the question, but the last review you've spoken to has gone on for months. So how long will this review take?
I suspect it would only be a matter of weeks.
Mr. Jones?
Yes, I still would like Mr. Case to tell the committee whether or not he is aware whether any private donations were used to pay the cost of refurbishing the flat.
Look, Mr. Jones...
Are you aware of that, Mr. Case?
So I have, I do not have all of the facts and details at my disposal on this, which is why the Prime Minister's asked me to conduct this review, and as I said, set out those conclusions for the committee.
That's absolutely fine. So you don't have all those details. Could you tell us what propriety issues fall to be considered in relation to this?
Yes, absolutely. I think there are predominantly two areas. The first is the making sure that any donations obviously are sound from a propriety point of view, making sure that donations aren't being used to sort of seek preferment or such. And then the second point is ensuring that such donations are declared in the proper way, which I know the Prime Minister is committed to doing. in relation to his own declaration of the Register of Ministerial Interests. And that's the sort of detail I'll need to get back to the committee on through this review.
Thank you for that. So just again, to be absolutely clear, you've indicated that there is no charitable trust in existence to cover the cost of maintenance and refurbishment of the flat. Is it the case, therefore, that any such donations, if there are any, would be political donations?
I can't answer that question today. I don't have all of those details. That's one of the things I'll have to look at as part of this process the Prime Minister's asked me to do, and I'm happy to set those out in writing for the committee.
Well,
it's been reported that the Electoral Commission are investigating this issue. Is that right?
So, as I understand it, there is an ongoing conversation between the Electoral Commission and CCHQ, but obviously that's not a matter for civil servants or the government. So I'm not cited on the detail of those conversations, Mr. Jones.
Thank you very much,
Mr. Case. You've known you've been coming to this committee, for which we're grateful, for some weeks now. There are a number of, how can I put it, topical issues about the place at the moment. One of which is the vexed question of a flat's refurbishment. I'm surprised that you haven't been better furnished with the answers to give to the committee. Has no conversation taken place between yourself and others as to what on earth, is this a storm in a teacup, or is it more serious? I'm surprised you haven't been briefed further.
So what I really want to avoid doing, Mr. Chair, is actually misleading the committee in any way by giving you partial insights. The Prime Minister's asked me to do this review, which I will do, and as I said, he's asked me to share those conclusions with you.
And you will be able to set the date for the publication, or at least writing to us, because it'll be review beyond your terms, will it not?
Yes, absolutely.
So have you done so yet? How long do
No.
you think this will take?
No, but I will do. I'll come back to you, Mr. Chairman, as soon as I can with the timescale for this.
Thank you. Mr. MacDonald, please.
I don't wish to be rude, Mr. Case, but this is coming across like a badly scripted version of Yes Minister. Let me just ask you one thing. Could you at least provide us within a limited period of time, say a week, of the information about what advice the Prime Minister was given and by whom about the propriety issues of the flat refurbishment being funded by party political donations? If we could have just the trail of when the Prime Minister was advised and by whom, it would be very helpful. If we could have that quickly, shouldn't require a detailed review or time-consuming review. We could simply have that would be very helpful.
Yeah, I'm very happy to do that, Mr. MacDonald.
Thank you. Ronnie Cowan, please.
Thanks, Chair. To both our witnesses today, really, I'm sure both of them to add to this. The independent advisor to ministerial interests is responsible for advising ministers about how to comply with the ministerial code. But we haven't had one for over 5 months since Sir Alex Allen resigned. How has this impacted on your role and on the oversight of propriety and ethics in government more generally?
Shall I go first? Yeah. The independent advisor, on ministerial interests is an important role. It's, of course, only one part of the jigsaw underpinning propriety and ethics. It's the independent advisor has a couple of specific functions, one relating to ministerial interests and the other to do with investigations. I think, in my experience so far, it's not had a particularly significant impact, but we need, and I know the Prime Minister is clear that he needs to get a new independent advisor in post as soon as possible. Darren, do you want to add?
Well, just to add that the principal source of advice for ministers on propriety and ethics is their permanent secretaries, so they've still got access to that during this last period, and of course they can come to me and my team if there's something particularly complex.
So So 5 months without one, nobody seems to have noticed. Is that the message I'm getting?
I don't think it's 5 months and nobody's noticed. I don't think that is what we're saying. It has been noticed. It is an important role, which is why the Prime Minister is seeking to appoint somebody very shortly.
Now, would your involvement in the Greensill affair been different if an independent advisor had been in post?
I think it's an interesting question. I think actually the majority of issues to do with the Greensill affair have actually related to a former government, not current ministers, which wouldn't have been something for the independent advisor. I think actually under any circumstances, given the scale of issues that have come up through the revelations, I think it certainly would have taken a good deal of our time under any circumstances. But I don't think the independent advisor would have been particularly involved. It's one of those things that requires a bespoke process, which is why the Prime Minister has asked Nigel Boardman to conduct a review, and I know this committee and the Treasury Select Committee are also looking into this. Anything you want to?
Nothing else.
Sorry.
So you mentioned the recruitment of the independent advisors ongoing, but we were told this last December. Michael Gove told us that the recruitment for Sir Alex's successor was underway. So do we know how far this has gone down, or when should we expect an announcement?
Very shortly. The Prime Minister is in the final stages of discussions with the leading candidate, so I hope we'll be able to announce very shortly.
Weeks rather than months?
I hope days rather than weeks, but don't hold me to that.
We're making progress then. So given the circumstances under which Sir Alex departed, are you worried that his successor will maybe lack public confidence?
Darren may want to comment on this too, but it's always been a tough job given the role. It is an important one. It has to be done by somebody of sufficient independence, and absolutely vital that the independent advisor can command public confidence. I think that's why getting the right criteria, the right person, the right terms of reference is so important. Darren, do you want to?
Nothing else to add. I agree with you. The criteria was the important element.
Thank you, Mr. Cowan. Can I go to Lloyd Russell-Moyle, please? Lloyd Russell-Moyle.
Thank you. The independent advisor is appointed by the Prime Minister. Seeing that it was the Prime Minister's inaction that led to the last advisor feeling like he had to leave, and we've now seen the Prime Minister texting friends about tax reforms in the UK so they can come back and not pay their taxes, or even some of the stuff in the front pages today. Is it important that there is a role for other people other than the Prime Minister in the recruitment process? And what is your role in that recruitment?
As you say, this is a direct appointment for the Prime Minister. Darren can add, but we've had sort of three aspects to our role in this. First is developing the criteria for the role. In HR speak, the person specification, the sorts of characteristics you're looking for. We've also been involved in drawing up a short list of candidates for the Prime Minister. And then we've been involved in supporting the Prime Minister in the remit of the job. Anything you want to?
Just possibly to add what the criteria were. So there was integrity and independence. We were seeking expertise and experience, both of government and the Constitution, and someone who could command the trust of the Prime Minister of the day.
Okay, so are you saying that there was a preferred candidate that the Prime Minister is considering as we speak?
Correct.
Thank you. Lloyd Russell-Moyle.
And that preferred candidate is someone that you have put forward?
Yeah, we put forward a short list to the Prime Minister, discussed that with him, and he's then gone for a preferred candidate from that list.
I mean, committee would like to conduct a pre-appointment hearing with that preferred candidate. Can you undertake to ensure that that happens?
I mean, obviously it couldn't be a pre-appointment hearing as such because it's a prime ministerial appointment, but I know that Sir Alex came before this committee early in his tenure, and we will encourage the same of the new independent advisor.
Do you think it's appropriate that this is a prime ministerial appointment?
I think it is. It stems from the constitutional reality of how ministers are appointed. Under the royal prerogative, ministers are appointed on the advice of the Prime Minister.
Is the Prime Minister not also responsible for ensuring that they fulfil the standards that the independent advisor is meant to be laying down?
Everybody in government is responsible for upholding the standards in public life. Sorry, have I misunderstood your point?
How can the independent advisor be looking at the actions of the Prime Minister if they're appointed by the Prime Minister?
Well, I think that is perfectly possible when you've got an individual in place who meets the sort of criteria that Darren has set out. Somebody who's capable of, and actually earlier question, capable of commanding public confidence. That person would have the authority, by their very nature to raise with the Prime Minister questions, I think.
Okay. Yeah, and you're confident. Sorry, Mr. Russell-Moore. Mr. Case, you're confident. I'll go if I may. You're confident the person that has been recommended to the Prime Minister is such a character?
Yes, I mean we wouldn't have put the person on the shortlist if we didn't believe that.
Thank you, Mr. Russell-Moore.
So Alec had to resign because the Prime Minister refused to uphold his advice. So what additionally will this candidate have to prevent the Prime Minister running roughshod over them?
So actually as part of this round, we've actually the Prime Minister's actually asked us to look at the remit of the role and the powers that the independent advisor has.
Well, I wonder if at that juncture that I could perhaps bring Rachel Hopkins in, just to preempt perhaps what you might be about to say. Rachel.
And thank you, Chair. And it's just to build on what Lord Evans, the Chair of the Committee on Standards and Public Life, who's written to the Prime Minister suggesting that, amongst other things, the independent advisor be empowered to initiate their own inquiries into alleged breaches in the ministerial codes. So is this part of that, is this a change that you would welcome?
So, sorry, I was just saying in relation to the previous question, the Prime Minister's request as part of identifying a new advisor, we've been looking at how to amend the remit of the job, and we'll be announcing any changes at the same time as announcing the new independent advisor. Of course, those changes are ultimately a decision for the PM, but I know he's been paying close regard to the letter that you refer to, Lord Evans's letter, and I myself have been in discussion with Lord Evans about how the remit and how the role might work. So, but we'll set out any changes in when we make the announcement.
And I just, if I may, Chair, push on that question about your views on whether it's a positive thing that the independent advisor could initiate their own investigations, mainly drawing on the fact that at current times it's the Prime Minister who decides whether to investigate others. And I'm interested whether that means that he is immune from being investigated unless there's an independent advisor with their own remit to be able to investigate the Prime Minister.
Yeah, look, there are. I mean, this is one of the key changes to make that was brought out in Lord Evans' letter. I think it has to come, to the point you're making, I think it has merit. To it, precisely how it worked, I think, is something. So again, it all needs to flow from the core constitutional principle that the Prime Minister advises the sovereign on who to call to be her ministers. But I think it is something that it's something that we're looking at, and we'll set out changes when we make the announcement. Any changes.
Thank you. John MacDonald, please.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Tierney, when the Chair of the committee asked you about were you concerned about your own position if you were challenging ministers, basically, you answered very firmly no. But it goes beyond that. How proactive a role do you and does the Propriety and Ethics team take, for example, in relation to the enforcement of the ministerial code? Just how do you trigger action? What is the circumstances in which you would do that? And I just give these examples because I'm a bit mystified at the moment why there hasn't been more proactive engagement from yourself and your team. We've had the examples, I just give these examples. We've had the Chancellor of the Exchequer, his text being published where he's been pushing civil servants to act after private lobbying. We've had, in terms of donations to the Conservative Party, a number of firms where their donation to the Conservative Party is reported at least on a ratio of 10-1 with contracts. We've had the Secretary of State for Health admit belatedly that he's related to someone who's received the contract. And then we've had the Ministerial Register of Interests delayed some considerable time. Surely some of that would have triggered you into action, wouldn't it, if you had been proactive?
So I think the first thing is that we don't just wait for stuff to come to us. Although, as I said earlier, the vast majority of our casework comes from ministers proactively seeking advice up front. I think it's important, though, the ministerial code is clear that it's for ministers to satisfy themselves that they are following the ministerial code. It's even more explicit that it's not for the Cabinet Secretary or I to police the code. That's for ministers, and then the ultimate arbiter of ministerial conduct is the Prime Minister. That said, we don't just sit there and let things go by. We will get involved in specific cases when we see them as necessary or at the request of the Prime Minister.
Well, you provide advice, Mr. Tierney. On any of those instances, have you provided advice?
I don't think I want to get into individual cases, if that's okay with the committee.
Well, how can we tell whether you're doing your job if we ask you a specific question about whether you are doing your job and then you tell us you can't tell us whether you're doing your job?
I think what I'm saying is I don't think I want to comment on any ongoing casework that the team are doing.
So you are engaged in some of these matters I've listed?
We're engaged in a range of issues that are live at the moment.
Thank you for that. That's at least moves us a bit further forward. The issue around permanent secretaries and the role that they play is equally important. How important do you think the role of departmental secretaries is in ensuring that the relevant codes are adhered to? Because my fear is the one that the chair raised, really, which is in recent experience, it suggests that permanent secretaries who displease their secretaries of state don't seem to last very long in their posts. We saw what happened to Philip Rutnam. So how does a permanent secretary act as a regulator while keeping their jobs?
Do you want to try?
Yeah.
So actually, as you'll know, the role of permanent secretaries in the ministerial code is clearly set out. There's some specific examples on security of government business, matters relating to ministers' constituencies, and also supporting ministers in making sure that they avoid conflict or perception of conflict. I mean, I think on the point about, you know, the role of permanent secretaries and relations, actually, I think this came up when I was in front of the committee last time. Actually, the overwhelming majority of the experience of the relationship between ministers and civil servants, and between secretaries of states and permanent secretaries, is actually incredibly collaborative. As Darren says, in the vast majority of cases, actually ministers actively seek the support of their permanent secretaries and other officials, like like Darren, in upholding their obligations under the ministerial code.
When it came to Philip Brotman, his advice was not followed, and to maintain his integrity, he had no other choice but to resign. It sounds as though other permanent secretaries may not be so robust in challenging their secretaries of state, and that's how they survive.
Personally, I don't share that that view. Permanent secretaries, I know, are robust as they need to be, where they need to be in making sure that the minister's obligations under the ministerial code are upheld. But as I said, the issues around the ministerial code, difficulties, I think more often than not, it's ministers asking civil servants actively asking for support in making sure that they uphold their obligations under the various codes.
Sounds difficult to accept when the ministerial register of interest has been delayed yet again. But we'll await publication. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Rachel Hopkins.
Thank you, Chair, again. So there's the existing transparency scheme, and that covers meetings or gifts and hospitality. And can I just check, is that the one that's published quarterly, isn't it, with all those things on it?
Yeah,
that's right, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, that's right. Okay.
Sorry, I didn't
does
really
it, yeah, so just checking I've just got the right thing in my mind as well. And I just want to check, does it cover phone calls and text messages that senior ministers or senior civil servants may make in relation to these sorts of things where they need to declare them?
It doesn't cover phone calls unless the phone call is in place of a meeting, if that makes sense. So only if it's a phone meeting, but not routine phone calls, and it doesn't include texts.
Okay, so given everything that we've been talking about today and the public interest in a lot of that, if those sorts of calls and text messages aren't included, how can we ensure that standards are upheld, ministerial code is enforced, etc., in relation to these sorts of things?
Do you want me to?
Yeah.
I think, it's a good question, but actually I think the underpinning principles are there to answer your point, which is government business is government business, however it's conducted by whatever means of a communication, and anything that's government business has to be handled in line with the codes, FOI, Public Records Act, etc., etc. These things have to be retained, declared to officials as per the code, whatever the means of communication.
Okay, that's really helpful, because some of the issues that have been coming up, it's been mentioned briefly earlier, is around the Prime Minister saying he's going to publish text messages between himself and Mr Dyson and other business leaders in the public interest. Not come to light just yet. So when can we expect them, in the spirit of what you've just said?
As I understand it, the Downing Street published, I think it was on Friday, a document fulfilling the Prime Minister's commitment in the House. I think it was last Friday. Again, I'll have to check.
Okay. There's other senior ministers who, probably should follow suit then, if that's the case with the Prime Minister. Would you agree that it's appropriate that they should publish all text messages and those sorts of messages in order to ensure that they're being transparent and in accordance with the ministerial code?
Well, I mean, I think processes are there for for the purposes of transparency. So, for example, Freedom of Information Act is a way of getting hold of material relating to government business, that can be released under whatever the means of communication. So I think there are vehicles there for transparency.
Yeah, one of the points I'm very conscious of is around government business. Like I say, usually takes place with officials present, and therefore there will be a record or a note, and it's covered that way. But sometimes you seem to imply as well that government business takes place over the phone through a message, and it's obviously for ministers to then subsequently declare. But we've picked up that there have been reports that the Prime Minister still uses a personal mobile phone despite requests from the civil service to do so, to make sure that it can be managed and that it's secure. So what's been your advice about this, and how do you sort of help maybe prevent inappropriate, requests, lobbying through personal mobile phones if officials aren't present?
So, I mean, on the specific point, you'll be well aware that the Prime Minister, set out his account in the House last week, including making clear, as he's required to do, that any contact he gets through his personal phone, he's got to declare to officials, and I think he set that out in the House. The question about personal mobile phones is a good one. The communications security is obviously important, and ministers get advice on that. And, for example, we regularly do sessions at Cabinet on security. The committee will understand by long-standing convention. I won't go into the sort of detail of the advice that I've given the PM or my predecessors have. But actually the thing about changing telephone numbers and personal phones, I think, can be a bit of a red herring, if I'm honest. Prime Ministers, other ministers like parliamentarians actually need to be in touch with a very large number of people, colleagues around the House, across government, etc. So, I won't invite you to comment, but I think most parliamentarians, the reality is your telephone number would become quite widely known just because of how you have to do your business. So, the question is how do you protect overall security, and there's a range of measures on that. And as for the question about lobbying, the processes are sort of well established, that if it's government business and an official's not there to record it, in the moment, at the first opportunity, ministers should be declaring this to their officials to make sure it's recorded.
I'm pleased to hear you say about declaring it at the first opportunity, because we know through other recent issues, I'm thinking sort of West Ferry, some of these had to be teased out because it wasn't at the time. One of my big concerns, and you touched on it there about security, is whether personal phones are sufficiently encrypted or as secure as a government issued, ministerial phone. Because we've seen in other cases some, people have hacked into, significant people's phones and used it as a means to sort of blackmail or embarrass in that respect. So can we be assured, what's to stop our Prime Minister being vulnerable to inappropriate lobbying or blackmailing in that respect if he's using a personal mobile phone?
So obviously we put security packages around all the communications that ministers have by whatever means. Actually, as you may well know, actually the levels of encryption and standards of security on everybody's mobile phone are increasing all of the time, because it's in the interests of the manufacturers. It's customers all around the world demand it now. So, but there are everybody needs to follow the basic cyber security advice about how to protect your devices. It's the same advice to the public as it is to ministers, to be honest. Obviously, government-issued IT is, in most instances, slightly more secure. Obviously, the highly classified stuff, much more secure. But, actually, the levels of encryption and security on most people's mobile phones is really pretty good. And if you use it in the right way, two-factor authentication, all that sort of stuff, standard cybersecurity advice, you can actually end up with very secure devices in everybody's hands or pockets.
And just final point around obviously, people do business in this whole sort of new way, messages and phone, mobile phones and stuff. You're saying, is the ministerial code suitably robust in relation to all this more technological communication methods? Does it cover it sufficiently?
A good question. I think I come back to my point before, which is actually the principles are there that underpin this, which is if it's government business, it's government business, and needs to be declared and recorded in the proper ways, and that's set out on the ministerial code. I think. I can't think that technology fundamentally changes the requirements. It's a means of communication that's changing rather than the fundamentals of needing to maintain, recording of government business. Sorry.
Okay, thank you, Chair.
Thank you. We're going to move on now to look at the Greensill episode and to open questions on that to my colleague David Jones.
Thank you, Chairman. Mr. Case, was Lex Greensill employed as a special advisor at Downing Street?
Before I go on, the answer to your question is he wasn't employed as a special advisor, but if I may, just at the outset, we know the committee's looking into this, and we're here to help as much as we can on that. As you know, the PM set up the Boardman review. So what we'll do today is give you as many of the facts as we've got. Some of those we've obviously only been able to have a cursory look in terms of handing material over to Mr. Boardman. So we won't be able to give you all of the answers. We'll give you what we've got, and Mr. Boardman will. But Darren, do you want to go through?
Could I say you've given a clear answer to Mr. Jones's first question that says that Mr. Greensill was not employed as a special advisor at Downing Street. Is that correct?
Correct.
Right, Mr. Jones. Next question.
Yes, thank you. Well, I just remark in passing that famously Mr. Greensill's business card announced that he was a senior advisor at the Prime Minister's office. So what was the nature of his role?
So I'm happy to pick that up, Mr. Chairman, if that's okay. So as we said, he wasn't a special advisor. His exact status is unclear, and that's one of the things that we've asked Nigel Boardman to look into. He was appointed as an unpaid advisor on supply chain finance in January 2012. He did that until 2015. In 2013, he also became a Crown representative, which lasted until 2016 when he left the Cabinet Office. His status as a senior, as an advisor, it's unclear what basis that has, and as I say, that's something that we've asked Nigel Boardman to specifically look into.
Was he present in Downing Street pursuant to the terms of any contract?
We've been unable to find a contract. What we've found so far are an appointment letter and then subsequent reappointment letters, which set out some conditions on his appointment, things like the Official Secrets Act, confidentiality, seeking or using the business appointment rules when he leaves. But so far we've been unable to identify a contract.
Who signed the appointment letter?
The initial appointment letter was signed by a director in it was called then the Efficiency and Reform Group of the Cabinet Office. We've had some evidence that the appointment was signed off by the then Minister for the Cabinet Office and the then Permanent Secretary in the Cabinet Office.
Could you
That would be Sir John Manzoni, yes?
No, that would have been Ian Watmore at the time, and the minister was Francis Maud.
I wonder, Mr. Tierney, before interrupting David Jones, forgive me, Mr. Tierney, would you be able to publish that appointment letter, or at least furnish the committee with it?
I can't think why not, but I mean, if there is a reason why not, we'll let you know. But
And obviously we've given all this to Nigel Boardman as well.
Thank you. Mr. Jones?
Yes. So, presumably, Mr. Greensill had a pass to work at number 10?
He did. He was given a pass and IT for the Cabinet Office and a pass and IT subsequently for number 10.
And was he subject to the same level of security, vetting and clearance as other members of staff who work at Downing Street?
He did have the appropriate level of security clearance. It wasn't there immediately on his appointment. It happened several months later, but that's not entirely unusual.
So can I just pick up on that? We're not entirely, are we clear whether he actually worked in Downing Street? That the fact that he had a business card, etc., doesn't actually necessarily mean he was working from Downing Street?
Right.
I don't think he did actually.
He had access to Downing Street?
Yes.
Yes.
What was he doing when he was there? Just popping in for a cup of tea, or what was he doing?
We don't know. We weren't involved at the time. This is something that...
No, indeed. It's the purpose of the investigation to find out, yes. David Jones?
I find it extraordinary that you come before this committee and not really knowing anything about the terms upon which Mr. Greensill managed to be installed in Downing Street, which members of the committee may find rather alarming.
Well, I mean, as Darren set out, I mean, the Prime Minister...
Mr. Case, if the committee is alarmed, are you alarmed by this?
Yes.
Mr. Jones?
So it was approved by a minister and by the Permanent Secretary of the Cabinet Office.
The initial appointment, which was for 3 months, was approved by the Minister and the Permanent Secretary. We have found no evidence that subsequent extensions to that appointment were approved by ministers. But that's one of the things, again, that we've asked Nigel Boardman to look into.
Do you know the background to his introduction to Downing Street? Do you know why it was thought it would be a good idea for him to work there?
I mean, I think we're reasonably clear that Jeremy Haywood was seeking to bring Lex Greensill into work in the Cabinet Office, to bring his expertise of supply chain finance to bear to some policy issues that were around at the time.
So Jeremy Haywood had worked with Lex Greensill in the private sector, I think that's right, isn't it?
Yes, they both worked together, and I think it was Morgan Stanley.
Is it fair to assume, therefore, that it was Jeremy Haywood's introduction that led to Mr. Greensill being installed in Downing Street?
I think so, although, as I said, Nigel Boardman is looking into those precise circumstances of his access to Downing Street.
You said that it was, forgive me Mr. Jones again, you said it was Francis Maud and Ian Watmore who made the original 3-month appointment, yet he was there for some years. Who signed off on the reappointment?
That's unclear.
Is there no documentation, a letter that says after 3 months you can carry on for another 3 months doing whatever it is you're doing?
So that we have found further letters of appointment, either from HR teams or his then line management changed from one bit of the Cabinet Office to another. What we haven't found is who authorised above those appointment letters.
You made clear what the first part of the oversight was in the Cabinet Office, which was the second part.
It was then the Economic and Domestic Affairs Secretariat. It moved from ERG to EDS.
And who headed that?
The person named on the as line manager there was Claire Sumner.
Did she not sign it off? Was it not for a minister to sign off, given it had been done by a minister in the first place?
Again, I think that's all clear.
Forgive me, Mr. Jones, for interrupting you.
Yeah, that's all right, Chairman. Just to be clear, Mr. Greensill was in the business of selling services to HM government, wasn't he?
I'm not sure I can answer that. He at that point, he had only just set up his company.
That was how it transpired, isn't it? that he was selling services to the government?
Again, we've asked Nigel Boardman to look into the details here, but my understanding is Greensill Capital didn't have any contracts with government until much later on, until I think 2018.
Is it fair to say that he would have been in a position to acquire information during his period of employment by the government? No, forgive me, not employment, working at Downing Street. He would have acquired information that would have been of assistance to him in deciding the basis upon which he would offer commercial services to the government.
I think it's exactly that potential conflict of interest that we've asked Nigel Boardman to look at.
I mean, you say potential conflict of interest. Doesn't it look like a screaming, glaring conflict of interest?
Yes, it does.
And does it not look appalling incompetence on the part of those senior officials and ministers who recommended that he be installed in Downing Street?
Well, what we haven't seen is the evidence of how the conflict was to be managed, and that's what we've asked Nigel Boardman to look into.
Thank you, Mr. Tierney.
I wonder, Mr. Case, on one of the specific areas of alleged conflicts of interest with Mr. Greensill, are you aware that Greensill's contract with the NHS was open to competitive tender?
I'm not aware. I don't have that detail. I don't. No, sorry, not something that I'm familiar with.
I assume, therefore, but the Boardman review will be looking at that.
Yes, of course.
Yes, it will.
All of these questions are ones that we've asked. The Prime Minister's asked Mr. Boardman to look at.
Thank you. John Stevenson, please.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Case, are there people working in government who are not paid by government? And if so, how many are there?
So are there people working in government who aren't paid by government? So unpaid advisors, yes, there will be people who've got unpaid advisor status. I would think.
Do you have any indication of how many there are then?
I'm afraid I don't know. It would be something we very happily look into and come back to you on that. I mean, I'm not aware
so
of.
You'll confirm to the committee how many that there are.
I mean, as much as we can determine. I mean, I don't think there's anybody who will be in a similar position to Lex Greensill. But there may be other unpaid advisors in government, and we can set those out.
Confirm to the committee. Thank you. Are these individuals then subject to the same regulatory regime that those who are employed, who are paid by the civil service? Are they covered by the same regulatory regime?
Do you want to do this?
So if
status?
Yeah. So if they're employed as civil servants. Then they will be. So ministers can make direct appointments, and they will be civil servants, and they'll be subject to the code in the normal way.
So if they're not civil servants, they're not covered by the same regime. Is that correct?
If they're not civil, so if they're a special advisor, they have their own code. If they sit on the board of a department or a non-executive, there's a separate code that governs their conduct as well.
Okay, would they be included in the register of special advisors?
No, to be a special advisor, it's quite a distinct process. They have a particular legal status under the Constitutional Reform and Governance Act, and we keep a register of who the special advisors are.
So how then can we find out exactly who they are? What list are they published?
I'm not sure that there is a separate list for direct appointments.
So potentially there are unpaid advisors to government that we have absolutely no idea about being able to ascertain who they are.
I mean, I think potentially yes, but I'm not imagine, like, as the Cabinet Secretary said, I don't imagine you're going to find very many of them who don't.
No, it doesn't matter if there are only 2 or 3, but they could be influencing government in a way that I think we should be aware of. Would you agree?
These are, I mean, good questions, and I'd like to take them away and come back with the assurance that we can give you, if we can't give you the assurance, what we're going to do about it.
Right, so you'll give us a list of who they are and how we can get a published list of their as individuals. Fine. Just final question. What do you do with people who are seconded into government? Are they treated like contractors, or how are they dealt with?
It will depend on the basis on which they've been seconded in, but most of them will be subject to ongoing kind of duties of confidentiality and the like. But it will depend on the specific circumstances.
Fine. So again, this committee could get a list of those who are seconded into government as well. Quite often
we'll set it out as best we can. Actually, there will be I suspect, a large number of secondments into the civil service and what have you, who will be, there under the same status as civil servants. But we will give you the best account that we can.
Thank you. Just very quickly, thank you, John. Lloyd Russell-Moyle, please.
Do you think it's acceptable that there are effectively some people advising government, however small numbers, there is no record of that you can easily get to, and that seem to be covered by no guidelines and standards?
Shall I? I mean, I think the point is we don't have that list, but obviously we do require.
No, I don't care about the list. I want to know whether you think it is acceptable that is the practice that is proliferated.
I mean, I don't believe it is proliferated. The clear obligation on.
One or two cases of that case have happened.
So, for me, I can't explain the Green Seal case.
I'm not asking you to explain. I'm asking you whether you think it's an acceptable standard of practice. You are the head of the civil service.
So, I don't think it's acceptable. I don't believe it is. It is a common practice. I certainly don't think there's anything happening at the moment that's the equivalent. And of course, that's why we ask permanent secretaries and others who are in charge of department senior officials. All of these responsibilities are delegated, of course, down to them.
Thank you very much. Will you be asking your permanent secretaries to ensure that this doesn't happen in the future?
Yes, of course. I mean, that obligation is already clear about on them, and we've discussed it obviously at length in the context of the Green Seal.
When was that obligation made clear to them?
Well, actually, the sound management of their departments set out in Civil Service Management Code, managing public money. It's all already clear. But obviously, we've been discussing the implications and consequences.
They're unpaid advisors, so it's not about managing public money, is it?
No, but the principles around managing public and under the Civil Service Management Code are all there, and they would apply in terms of how you see these appointments and manage them.
So if you say that these appointments, it was always clear that these appointments were unacceptable, do you believe that then previous permanent secretaries and cabinet secretaries have dropped the ball and things that were unacceptable or allowed unacceptable things to happen?
Look, there are things that happened under Green Seal that we at the moment, we can't explain. There looked like there were conflicts, and we're not clear how they were managed.
I'm not talking about the conflicts. I'm talking about the appointment of unpaid advisors that then are not recorded anywhere within the system.
So, agree that there doesn't appear to have been, certainly from our cursory thing and look, and of course Nigel Boardman will go into the detail. We can't see the evidence that you're looking for. We haven't been able to see it. That doesn't look right. But equally, Mr. Boardman will go through this in detail, and there may be things that he can discover and bring forward that shows that these things were there. But we haven't seen them at the moment.
Okay. Well, let's hope something comes to light.
Thank you very much. Now, Mr. Case, thank you for writing to me earlier today with the outcome of the audit you conducted into civil servants, perhaps with second jobs. Could you perhaps just give me a very brief overview and express any concerns that you have as a result of that audit?
Yep, of course. So as set out in the letter, no instances of senior civil servants holding outside interests that conflict with their or considered to conflict with their roles or obligations under the code. There are as I say, fewer than 100 senior civil servants who hold paid employment outside the public sector alongside their civil service role, but these are roles like tutoring and yoga instructors and sports instructors, and those have all been considered by permanent secretaries and concluded that then there's no conflict with obligations under the code. I think in terms of conclusions, as I set out in the letter, there are some things that we need to tighten up. So I think we need to get greater consistency across departments about how outside interests are managed, and there's a range of things that I've set out in my letter to you, Mr. Chair, about declarations being done on at least an annual basis, including nil returns, declaring as you go. But then I think the really important steps are the assurance around that, so asking departmental audit and risk committees to provide assurance, setting more out in annual report and accounts, providing annual returns to the Cabinet Office, and I'm also looking at any new structures that we need to monitor the overall position and look at any particular cases. But before doing that, I'm obviously waiting for Nigel Baldwin to conclude his review, because those would be the sorts of recommendations I'd want to incorporate.
Thank you. And in terms of those structures, of course, one of the key one is ACABA, the Advisory Committee on Business Appointments. And have you made the same observation that I have, that perhaps senior civil servants are given titles such as director rather than more senior titles, so that they avoid the scrutiny of ACABA when they come to leave their office?
I'm not sure of the instances you're talking about, but I'm very happy to look at any particular instances.
And so, for example, they would be paid far more on the pay scale. Their responsibilities would be more extensive than the run-of-the-mill director role, and yet they'd be given that title because it seems to me to be the title that matters if a senior civil servant is considered by ACABA, rather than their remit and previous remuneration.
Apologies, I didn't catch the point first time round. So yeah, I mean, ACABA is determined by a grade. It's directors general and permanent secretaries, as you're suggesting. You have to go through ACABA. Of course, exactly the same principles have to be applied, but they're done at a departmental level. So instead of going to ACABA, it's permanent secretaries who have to apply the same rules to those below Director General.
But they're quite senior roles and quite extensive responsibilities,
yes.
And indeed the cases for conflicts of interest are sometimes quite apparent. The one advantage, I suppose, of the ACABA process is at least the nicely worded letters are put in the public domain. There's no such public scrutiny for those decisions made by permanent secretaries, is there?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good point, and I think Lord Pickles may have mentioned to the committee, we've been working with ACABA for the last few months on some reforms that may be made, and obviously we'll now need to incorporate conclusions from the Boardman process in that. But I think I think this is an area where reform is required, but we need to we need to move in an informed way.
Can I just check on my colleague John Stevenson, if you indicate you wish to come in with a supplementary question?
I'm fine, thank you, Chair.
In which case we'll go to David Jones.
Thank you, Chairman. Mr. Case, Mr. Bill Crothers was a senior civil servant who was permitted to work simultaneously with Greensill. That's right, isn't it?
Yes, that's correct.
And what was his role in the civil service at that time?
I'm going to have to go to.
I think he was the Chief Procurement Officer.
Okay, Chief Procurement Officer.
So the position is that the government's Chief Procurement Officer was permitted to work simultaneously with an organisation whose business was selling services to the government. Is that correct?
I mean, as we understand, that's what it looked like, which I think is, you would agree, looked like a pretty extraordinary set of circumstances.
It does look extraordinary, and what I'd like to know is who actually approved this arrangement.
On more detail, one for Nigel Boardman, but our understanding is that this was the then Cabinet Secretary and Chief Executive of the Civil Service who agreed this.
Who was?
So Cabinet Secretary at the time would have been Jeremy Hayward and was it John Manzoni? Yeah.
So Sir Jeremy Hayward and Sir John Manzoni approved this. Did this require any ministerial approval?
I don't think it did.
You mentioned, Mr. Case, it looks pretty extraordinary. That is, I think, possibly an understatement, given the roles that Mr. Crothers was performing in the civil service and simultaneously performing within Greensill. You clearly have carried out some research into this. This was approved without any ministerial input at all, is that right?
That's
as far as we understand it, yep.
Is this something that is routinely done?
Well, obviously, when this came up, I think the phrase was a source of acute concern, and I think the Prime Minister referred to this in the House, I think 2 or 3 weeks ago. Prime Minister's questions that he and I felt. I personally have never heard of anything like it before, and having talked to current and former colleagues, no one else seems to have seen anything quite like it.
Have you examined the papers surrounding the approval of Mr. Crothers to work at Greensill?
I'm going to have to let Mr. Turney answer this one. He's been going into the detail of these ones.
So we've seen some email exchanges which look like they confirm the appointment, but as we keep saying, we've asked Nigel Boardman to look in more detail at the process and the decision making here.
Yes, I understand that Mr. Boardman is conducting an inquiry, but so is this committee. And I think it's very important that we have as much information as possible, as soon as possible. In the light of the papers that you've consulted, can you find any good reason being set out for this arrangement being put in place?
The reasons that I've seen, there were two. One is that at the time Greensill Capital didn't have any public sector work, and I can't remember now what the second was.
Why should it be a matter of concern to senior officials that Greensill Capital didn't have any public sector work?
I can't answer that. I wasn't involved in the decision making, but that was one of the factors.
I mean, it seems an extraordinary point to make. I mean, it looks very much as if senior officials were putting in place an arrangement that would make it easier for Greensill Capital to obtain public sector work.
Yeah, I mean, I think as you said, we cannot explain how these decisions were taken or why. It's why they're of acute concern and why we recognise that the committee's conducting its own investigation inquiry into this, and will help further where we can. But for us, at our first look, we can't explain many of these things. It does not look appropriate. But Nigel Boardman has been commissioned by the Prime Minister, and this is the one thing that one of the many things he'll have to look into to tell us whether there are things that we haven't spotted. He will of course be able to interview people, etc., and we'll have more time than we've had to look into these things.
Mr. Crothers then went to work on permanently for Greensill. That's right, isn't it?